The message that changed everything. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stared at the alien text on her screen, her coffee growing cold beside her. For 3 years, she'd been part of humanity's first contact linguistics team, trying to decode the languages of the 12 species that made up the Galactic Assembly. Most days, progress moved at a glacial pace. Today was different. The Kresh had sent a transmission, not to the Assembly's political leaders or military commanders, but directly to her small translation office on Station Harmony. The message was brief, written in their complex geometric script that shifted meaning based on dimensional layout. Sarah's translation software struggled with it, spitting out fragments that made no sense. Linguistic architect, survival imperative, human cognition unique, request immediate. She rubbed her tired eyes and started the translation manually, pulling apart each symbol's meaning, layer by layer. It took 4 hours. When she finally understood what the Kresh were asking, her hands trembled. They wanted her, specifically her, to come to their homeworld and attempt something no translator had ever done before: decode a dead language that might hold the key to their species' survival. An impossible request. Absolutely not, Commander Rodriguez said, his dark eyes hard. We don't send our people to alien worlds without full security protocols, especially not alone. Sarah stood her ground in his office, clutching the translated message. Commander, the Kresh are dying. Their star is destabilizing, and they've found ancient evacuation plans in ruins on their 4th moon. But the language is extinct, different from modern Kresh, and they can't read it. Their best linguists have been trying for 6 months. And they think a human can do better? Rodriguez's skepticism was clear. Dr. Mitchell, I respect your work, but this sounds like desperation, not logic. It's both, Sarah admitted. But they specifically requested that human translator because we process language differently than they do. The Kresh think in 3 spatial dimensions simultaneously. We think linearly, one word after another. They believe our sequential processing might be the key to unlocking a language that their own dimensional thinking can't grasp. She placed the message on his desk. Commander, we're talking about 40 billion lives. If they can't evacuate before their star collapses, an entire civilization will die. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. How long? They estimate 18 months before the star reaches critical instability, maybe less. And they think you can learn a dead language in that time. Sarah met his gaze. They think I might be their only chance. Journey into the unknown. The Kresh ship that came for her was beautiful and disturbing in equal measure. Its hull seemed to fold through dimensions that hurt to look at directly, existing in spaces that human eyes couldn't quite process. Sarah spent most of the 3-week journey in her quarters, fighting nausea and reviewing everything humanity knew about the Kresh. They were an old species, ancient when humans were still figuring out fire. Their bodies were crystalline, geometric forms that shifted and reconfigured based on emotional states and communication needs. They spoke through light patterns and dimensional vibrations. Only the translator device implanted behind Sarah's ear made communication possible. Her Kresh escort, a being who called itself Zenith of Understanding, visited her daily. Its crystalline body was predominantly blue, though flecks of silver appeared when it was curious. You are uncomfortable, Zenith observed through Sarah's translator. A device converted its light patterns into words she could understand, though it always felt like she was missing layers of meaning. Your ship exists in dimensions I can't fully perceive, Sarah said diplomatically. It's disorienting. Yet you came anyway. Why? Sarah considered the question. Because someone asked for help, and I might be able to give it. Isn't that enough? Zenith's form shifted, crystals rotating in a pattern Sarah had learned meant contemplation. Most species in the assembly act from self-interest. They negotiate, calculate advantages, measure benefits. You simply help. This is consistent with human behavior observed by the assembly. We find it illogical, also admirable. We're not saints, Sarah said with a tired smile. But we do tend to believe that if you can help someone, you probably should. Even at personal cost? Especially then. That's when it matters most. The ancient city, the Kresh homeworld, was like nothing Sarah had imagined. The sky held 3 suns at different stages of life, one yellow, one red, and the dying primary that glowed an ominous orange. The cities were impossible structures of light and crystal, buildings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Zenith brought her to the ancient ruins on the fourth moon, a dead city that predated modern Kresh civilization by millennia. The walls were covered in symbols that looked nothing like modern Kresh writing. Where current Kresh script was three-dimensional and geometric, this ancient language was linear, flowing, almost organic. "This is the archive," Zenith explained as they entered a massive chamber. "We believe it contains evacuation protocols, shelter locations, shit designs, everything our ancestors used when they fled their original homeworld before their first son died. But we cannot read it. Our linguists see the symbols as primitive, random, meaningless." Sarah approached the nearest wall, her breath catching. The symbols seemed to dance in the light, creating patterns that suggested meaning just beyond her grasp. She pulled out her portable scanner and began recording. "How long have your people been trying to decode this?" she asked. 6 months of intensive study, 3 years before that of preliminary analysis. We have mapped every symbol, cataloged every pattern. Nothing emerges." Sarah ran her fingers across the wall, not touching, but close enough to feel the strange energy the symbols seemed to emit. "That's because you're looking at it wrong." Zenith's crystals flashed surprise. "Wrong? You're trying to read it three-dimensionally like your modern language. But look at the symbols. They flow left to right, one after another. This is linear writing, sequential. You have to read it like a story, not like a spatial equation." She pulled out her tablet and began sketching. "See this repeated pattern here? It appears at the beginning of what I think are different sections. And this symbol shows up at the end of those sections. I think they're markers, like our chapters and periods. But language flows in time, not space." For the first time since meeting Zenith, Sarah saw its crystalline form pulse with what might have been hope. Breaking the code. The next 6 months were the hardest of Sarah's life. She lived in the ancient city, sleeping in a prefabricated hab unit while spending 18 hours a day studying the symbols. Zenith stayed with her, along with a team of Kresh linguists who watched her work with fascinated confusion. Sarah developed a system. She treated the ancient language like an archaeological puzzle, looking for patterns in how symbols related to each other sequentially. She borrowed techniques from decoding ancient human languages, looking for repeated phrases that might indicate common words, searching for symbols that appeared with unusual frequency, mapping symbol relationships. The breakthrough came on a rainy night, the toxic precipitation drumming against her hab unit's shields. Sarah was studying a long sequence of symbols that appeared multiple times throughout the archive when she suddenly saw it. "It's not a language," she breathed. "It's an instruction set." She called Zenith immediately, too excited to care that it was the middle of the Kresh rest cycle. "The symbols aren't describing things, they're commanding things. Look, this repeated sequence doesn't mean power source. It means activate power source." The ancient Kresh weren't writing to communicate. They were writing to program. Zenith's crystals flashed through a rainbow of colors. "Programming what?" Sarah's smile was fierce. "Everything. The whole archive is a manual. Step-by-step instructions for evacuating a planet, ship activation sequences, shelter construction protocols, supply chain management. Your ancestors didn't leave you a history book. They left you a survival guide. The race against time. Once Sarah cracked the fundamental nature of the language, progress accelerated. She developed a translation matrix that converted the ancient instruction-based writing into modern Kresh geometric script. It wasn't perfect. Nuances were lost, context sometimes unclear. But it was functional. The Kresh began implementing the ancient evacuation plans immediately. The archive contained designs for generation ships that could carry billions, instructions for creating stable dimensional pockets where populations could shelter, techniques for stellar engineering that might buy them precious extra time. But as Sarah translated more of the archive, she found something that chilled her. A final section, sealed behind symbols that translated to ultimate contingency. She brought Zenith to the chamber where she'd found it. I think this is what happens if they can't evacuate everyone in time. Some kind of last resort. Zenith's form dimmed. Can you translate it? Sarah had been working on it for 3 days. I think so. But Zenith, I don't think you're going to like it. She pulled up her translation on a holographic display. The ancient instructions were clear. If complete evacuation proved impossible, the remaining population should undergo a transformation. A permanent change to their physical forms that would allow them to survive in the hostile conditions that would exist after their son's death. It's describing how to turn your people into something else, Sarah said quietly. A form that doesn't need light or warmth, that can exist in the cold, dark space between stars. Your ancestors called it becoming the night. Zenith was silent for a long time. They planned to sacrifice what they were to survive. They planned to do whatever was necessary, Sarah corrected gently. But it was a last resort. Your ancestors hoped they'd never need it. The gift of choice. 15 months after Sarah arrived on the Kresh homeworld, the evacuation began in earnest. Massive ships constructed from ancient designs launched daily, carrying millions toward new worlds the assembly had helped identify. The dimensional shelter technology created safe hands for those waiting their turn to depart. But the numbers were brutal. Even with all their efforts, they would only evacuate 37 billion of the 40 billion Kresh before the star reached critical instability. 3 billion would be left behind. Sarah stood with Zenith on a platform overlooking the primary evacuation site, watching ships launch in a steady stream. The dying sun cast everything in shades of orange and red. 3 billion, Zenith said, its form a dull gray with grief. We will save most of our people, but 3 billion will die. Not necessarily, Sarah said quietly. You have another option, the transformation protocol, becoming the night. You think we should use it? I think you should have the choice. Your ancestors gave you that gift, a way to survive no matter what. Whether you use it or not, that's for the Kresh to decide. Zenith turned its crystalline form toward her. If it were humans facing this choice, what would your people do? Sarah thought about humanity's history, about all the times her species had faced extinction and clawed their way back. Honestly, we'd probably argue about it until the last possible second, then split into factions who each made different choices. Some would evacuate, some would transform, some would probably stay behind out of stubbornness or hope or love for their homeworld. We're not good at unanimous decisions. But what would you do, Sarah Mitchell, if you were Kresh and 3 billion of your people faced death or transformation? Sarah looked at the dying sun, thinking about impossible choices and necessary sacrifices. I'd want them to live, however they needed to, in whatever form they could. Because living means there's still hope, still possibility. Death is final, but transformation is just a different kind of survival. Zenith pulsed with colors Sarah had never seen before. The assembly believes humans are unique in their compassion, but I think you are unique in your hope. You believe in possibilities even when logic suggests none exist. Is that why you asked for me? Sarah asked. Because you needed someone who believed the impossible could happen? We ask for you because we needed someone who thinks sequentially, who could understand a language our dimensional minds could not process. Zenith paused. We kept you because you gave us something more valuable than translation. You gave us hope that there was a solution, and you gave us the tools to choose our own path forward. The final translation. The Kresh Council met in a chamber that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Sarah couldn't enter it. Human neurology would literally break trying to process that much spatial complexity. Instead, she watched through a dimensional projection that flattened the perceivings into something her brain could handle. The debate lasted 3 days. Every remaining Kresh had access to the translation Thera had completed. Every voice was heard. The discussion happened in light patterns Sarah couldn't fully read, but Zenith provided running translation. In the end, the Kresh made their choice. Not the unanimous one. Just as Sarah had predicted humans wouldn't achieve. 2 billion chose evacuation, accepting that they would wait until the final moments, trusting that the ships would carry them to safety. 1 billion chose transformation, deciding that survival in a new form was preferable to the risk of death. The transformation began 2 months before the star's projected collapse. Sarah watched from a safe distance as 1 billion Kresh entered specially prepared chambers and emerged changed. Their crystalline forms had become darker, denser, capable of existing without external light. They moved differently, communicated differently, but they were alive. When the evacuation ships made their final runs, all 3 billion Kresh left their homeworld safely. Some in their original forms, heading to new worlds. Others in transformed bodies, choosing to remain in the cold spaces between stars, creating new civilizations in places no one else could survive. Sarah stood beside Zenith on the last ship to leave, watching the Kresh homeworld shrink behind them. The orange sun pulsed with instability, days from collapse. "You saved us," Zenith said, its form now a deep blue shot through with gold. Colors Sarah had learned meant profound gratitude. "Without you, we would not have found the archive's secrets. We would not have had the choice." Sarah shook her head. "I just read the instruction manual. Your ancestors saved you. They saw this coming millennia ago and left you the tools you'd need. They left us symbols we could not read. You gave those symbols meaning. You gave us the choice between death and survival. This is not a small thing, Sarah Mitchell." The ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, and the Kresh homeworlds disappeared. Behind them, the star would soon explode, destroying everything. But the Kresh survived, all of them in different forms perhaps, but alive. Sarah thought about the ancient Kresh who had carved those instructions, who had planned for a catastrophe they hoped would never come. They'd left a gift for descendants they would never meet, a chance to survive when all seemed lost. That was the real translation, Sarah realized. Not converting symbols into words, but converting ancient hope into present survival. An ambassador without meaning to. Sarah returned to Station Harmony 6 months after the Kresh evacuation, expecting to resume her quiet work translating routine communications between species. Instead, she found her small office had been moved to a suite 3 times larger, with a waiting room full of alien visitors. "What is all this?" she asked Commander Rodriguez, who looked simultaneously proud and exhausted. "Dr. Mitchell, you're famous. The Kresh have been broadcasting your story throughout the assembly. You're the human who saved 40 billion lives by reading a language that a species couldn't read about themselves." He gestured to the crowded waiting room. "Everyone wants the human translator who thinks differently." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Commander, I'm not special. I just approached the problem from a different angle." "Exactly. And now 5 other species have contacted us with similar problems. Ancient texts they can't decode, lost technologies they can't understand. Cultural archives that have become mysteries to their own people." He handed her a datapad. "The Assembly has officially requested your services as a cross-cultural linguistic specialist. With significant compensation, I might add." Sarah scrolled through the requests, her head spinning. The Veltari needed help decoding medical texts from before their species underwent engineered evolution. The Cross Dominion had found a library on a colony world that used a dialect no modern Cross could read. The Terlian Collective had music archives they could no longer interpret. "I can't do all of this alone," Sarah protested. "You won't have to," Rodriguez smiled. "The Assembly approved funding for a department. You'll lead a team of human linguists, each specializing in different approaches to language. Linear thinkers for species that process information dimensionally. Dimensional thinkers to help species that process sequentially. Audio specialists. Visual specialists. Pattern recognition experts." He paused. "Sarah, you showed the Assembly something they didn't know about humans. We don't just think differently from other species. We think differently from each other. That cognitive diversity is a resource no one else in the galaxy has, quite the same way. Building bridges of understanding." Over the next year, Sarah assembled her team, 12 humans, each with unique approaches to language and cognition. Marcus Chen, who had synesthesia and could visualize languages as colors and shapes. Dr. Amara Okonkwo, who had pattern recognition abilities that bordered on supernatural. James Wu, who thought in musical structures and could find rhythm in any form of communication. Their first major project together was the Veltari Medical Archives. The Veltari had evolved themselves centuries ago, engineering their biology,
for life on harsh colony worlds. But in doing so, they'd lost the ability to understand the medical knowledge of their pre-evolution ancestors. Now they faced new diseases their engineered immune systems couldn't handle. And the treatments were locked in text they couldn't read. The Voltari language had changed because their sensory organs had changed. Ancient Voltari had perceived electromagnetic fields differently, and their written language incorporated those perceptions in ways modern Voltari literally couldn't see. Amara found the solution. She had a rare condition that made her sensitive to electromagnetic fields. What looked like random symbols to everyone else appeared as coherent patterns to her. Combined with Marcus's ability to visualize the symbols as color gradients, they created a translation method that converted electromagnetic perception markers into visual symbols modern Voltari could read.
It took 3 months. When they presented the translated medical texts to the Velthari Ministry of Health, the entire ministry wept, not with sound. Velthari didn't cry audibly, but with bioluminescent patterns that expressed grief and joy and relief all at once. "You have given us our own history back," the minister said through translation. "We had lost ourselves in becoming what we are now. You reminded us who we were." The music that wouldn't die. The Turellian project was different. The Turellians were an insectoid species with a profound cultural connection to music. Their entire history was encoded in sonic patterns, melodies that carried meaning beyond simple entertainment. But a plague 3 centuries ago had damaged the audio processing centers in the Turellian neural structure. Modern Turellians could still create music, but they'd lost the ability to hear the deep layers of meaning their ancestors had encoded in their symphonies. James Wu volunteered to lead this project. He'd been born deaf and received cochlear implants at age 7, giving him a unique perspective on how sound could be processed and perceived in different ways. "The problem isn't that they can't hear the music," James explained to Sarah after studying the Turellian archives for 2 weeks. "It's that they're trying to hear it the way their ancestors did. But that's impossible. Their neurology has literally changed. We need to find a new way to experience the meaning without requiring the same biological hardware." He proposed translating the sonic layers into other sensory formats. Working with a Turellian cultural historian named Clicking of Stones, the closest translation Sarah's implant could manage, James developed a system that converted the meaningful sound layers into visual patterns, tactile vibrations, and olfactory markers. The first Taiwan modern Turellian experienced their ancestral music through James's multisensory translation. They stood motionless for 6 minutes, their antennae quivering. Then they spoke, their translator converting clicks and chirps into words Sarah could understand. "I know what we were. I remember what we lost, and I understand that we can still be who we were meant to be, just differently." Sarah watched James's face as he received this feedback. He was crying, tears streaming down his cheeks. Later, she asked him why. "Because that's what I felt when I got my implants," he said. "I'd never heard my mother's voice before, but when I finally could, I understood what I'd been missing and what I'd still found. The Turellians lost something, but they didn't lose everything. They just needed someone to help them find a new path to the same truth." The cascade effect. News of the translation department's successes spread throughout the assembly. More requests poured in, not just for linguistic help, but for help bridging cognitive gaps between species. The Drenth, a hive mind species, needed help understanding the concept of individual identity, because they were trying to negotiate with species who thought as individuals. Sarah's team developed cognitive frameworks that translated individual decision-making into distributed consensus models the Drenth could understand. The Solari, energy beings who existed primarily in higher dimensions, wanted to understand physical species who experience time linearly. Marcus created visualization tools that allowed Solari to perceive linear time as a dimension they could observe, helping them grasp why physical species made decisions that seemed illogical from a higher dimensional perspective. Each project revealed something new about cognition, about how different species process reality. And each project revealed something about humanity. "We're like cognitive chameleons," Amara said during a team meeting. "We don't think in just one way.
We have visual thinkers and verbal thinkers and spatial thinkers, then kinesthetic thinkers. Some of us see time as a line, others as a circle. Some of us process emotions through logic, others through intuition. We're not just diverse culturally, we're diverse neurologically, and that makes us perfect translators, Janes added, because somewhere among us, there's probably a human whose brain works at least partially like any given alien species. Sarah nodded, understanding. We bridge gaps because we contain gaps within ourselves. Our cognitive diversity is our strength.
The price of success. But success came with complications. Some species in the assembly began to worry about humanity's growing influence. The Crete Syndicate, a collection of species that prided themselves on pure logical thinking, filed a formal complaint. Humans are contaminating pure forms of knowledge with their interpretation, the syndicate's representative declared at an assembly session. They cannot translate without transforming. They impose their cognition on information that should remain pure. Sarah was required to respond. She stood before the assembly, hundreds of species gathered in a chamber that existed in multiple simultaneous realities, and felt the weight of what she needed to say. The syndicate is correct, she began, and felt surprise ripple through the chamber. We do transform what we translate. All translation is transformation. You can't move meaning from one framework to another without changing something. She pulled up holographic displays showing the projects her team had completed. But that transformation isn't contamination. It's adaptation. The Kresh couldn't read their own archives until we showed them how to think sequentially. The Valthari couldn't access their own medical knowledge until we found a way to convert electromagnetic perception into visual symbols. The Torellians couldn't experience their own music until we translated sound into multisensory patterns. Sarah looked directly at the syndicate representative. Yes, we change what we translate, but the alternative isn't preserving pure knowledge. The alternative is that knowledge dying, locked away in formats that no one can access. Is that better? Is pure but inaccessible knowledge more valuable than transformed but usable knowledge? The assembly debated for 3 days. In the end, they ruled in favor of the translation department's work, but with conditions. All translations had to be clearly marked as interpretations. Original source materials had to be preserved. And most importantly, any species receiving translation services had the right to reject the translations if they felt the meaning had been too distorted. Sarah accepted these conditions readily. They were safeguards against exactly the kind of cognitive imperialism she wanted to avoid. The Legacy Project. 5 years after Sarah first traveled to the Kresh homeworld, the translation department had grown to include 50 human linguists and cognitive specialists. They'd completed projects for 17 different species, unlocking knowledge that had been thought lost forever. But Sarah's proudest achievement was something smaller and more personal. She'd been contacted by a young Kresh named Crystal of New Dawn, one of the first generation born after the evacuation. Crystal had a request that wasn't official, wasn't urgent, but mattered deeply. "We've learned our own history from you," Crystal said through translation. "You read our ancestors' words when we could not, but I want to understand how you did it. I want to learn to think the way humans think so I can help bridge gaps between my people and yours." Sarah agreed to take Crystal as a student. Over the course of a year, she taught the young Kresh everything she knew about sequential thinking, about processing information linearly, about all the techniques she'd used to decode the ancient archive. It was hard. Crystal's three-dimensional crystalline mind struggled with linear concepts the way humans struggled with dimensional mathematics. But Crystal persevered, developing hybrid thinking patterns that combined Kresh spatial processing with human sequential logic. "It hurts my mind," Crystal admitted during one session, "like trying to see in a direction that doesn't exist." "I know," Sarah said sympathetically. "That's exactly how I felt trying to understand dimensional Kresh writing. But you're doing it. You're learning to think in ways your neurology didn't evolve for. Do you know how remarkable that is?" Crystal's crystalline form pulsed with colors Sarah had learned meant determination mixed with pride. "If you could learn to read my ancestors' words by thinking differently, I can learn to think like you. It's only fair." By the end of the year, Crystal had become proficient in linear thinking. More importantly, Crystal had become a bridge, the first Kresh who could truly understand both human and Kresh cognition from the inside. This is the future, Sarah told her team as they watched Crystal successfully translate a human historical text into dimensional Kresh format. Not just humans helping other species, but other species learning to help us. True exchange, true mutual understanding. The message. Sarah received a personal message from Zenith of Understanding on the 6th anniversary of the Kresh evacuation. The old Kresh, who had been her guide and friend through those difficult months, had become a cultural historian among its people. I have been studying what happened, Zenith's message said. Not just the evacuation, but everything that came after. Your translation work, your teaching, the bridges you've built between species. The message paused, and Sarah could imagine Zenith's crystals pulsing with thought. I believe I understand now why you came when we asked, why you worked so hard to save people you had never met. It was not just compassion, though you possess that quality abundantly. It was something more fundamental to human nature. You believe in connection. You believe that understanding between different minds is possible and worthwhile. You believe that cognitive differences aren't walls to maintain, but bridges to build. This belief is so central to human thinking that you often don't even realize you're doing it. You saved my people, Sarah Mitchell. But more than that, you showed the galaxy something it had forgotten. That difference is not division. That thinking differently can mean thinking together. That the goal is not for everyone to think alike, but for everyone to understand how others think. Sarah read the message 3 times, tears blurring her vision. She'd never thought of her work in such grand terms. She'd just been trying to help, to solve problems, to make sure knowledge didn't die. But maybe Zenith was right. Maybe the work she'd been doing was about more than translation. Maybe it was about building a galaxy where cognitive diversity was celebrated, where different ways of thinking could complement each other, rather than conflict. The choice. Commander Rodriguez visited Sarah's office on a quiet evening, his expression serious. The Assembly wants to expand the translation department into a full institute. Permanent facility, unlimited resources, authority to work directly with any member species. You'd be the director. Sarah looked around her office, now familiar, after years of work. Through her window, she could see Station Harmony's central hub. Species of all kinds, moving through the corridors, living together, working together. That's a big responsibility, she said carefully. It's a recognition of what you've built, what you've achieved. Rodriguez sat across from her. But I need to know, is this what you want? You've become one of the most influential humans in the galaxy. You could write your own ticket to any position, any world. Are you sure you want to spend the rest of your life translating ancient texts and teaching aliens to think differently? Sarah thought about the Kresh archive, about the ancient instruction manual that has saved billions of lives. She thought about the Valtari discovering their medical history, the Torellians experiencing their ancestral music. She thought about Crystal of New Dawn, learning to think in lines instead of dimensions, building bridges between minds. I used to think language was about words, Sarah said slowly, about converting symbols from one system to another. But it's not. It's about understanding, about finding the meaning beneath the symbols and carrying that meaning across the gaps between minds. She looked at Rodriguez, her decision made. Yes, I want to do this. Not because I'm influential or recognized, but because there's still so much work to do. So many gaps to bridge. So many ways of thinking that need to be understood and shared. Then it's settled. Rodriguez stood, offering his hand. Congratulations, Director Mitchell. Sarah shook his hand, then looked back out at the station, at the incredible diversity of minds moving through the corridors. Each one thinking differently. Each one valuable. We're all translators in the end, she said quietly. Everyone trying to understand everyone else. I just happen to be good at it. Rodriguez smiled. You're not just good at it, Sarah. You showed the galaxy that it was possible. That's worth more than all the translations in the universe. Epilogue. 10 years later, the Institute for Cognitive Translation had facilities on 17 worlds, employed 300 human linguists and cognitive specialists, and had completed over 1,000 projects. But Sarah still kept her original office of Station Harmony,
still took personal projects, still taught students from species across the galaxy. Crystal of New Dawn had become the Institute's first non-human director of the Sequential Cognition Department. James Wu was leading a project to help the Dren hive mind understand human music. The Mara Okonkwo had discovered she could sense the quantum decision processes of the Solari, opening entirely new possibilities for translation between physical and energy-based species. On the anniversary of her first trip to the Kresh homeworld, Sarah received a package. Inside was a crystal, perfectly clear, inscribed with symbols in both ancient linear Kresh and modern dimensional Kresh. Her translator implant rendered both versions. For the one who taught us to read our own hearts, with eternal gratitude. Sarah held the crystal up to the light, watching patterns dance through its depths. Somewhere in those patterns, she could see all the work yet to be done, all the minds yet to be bridged, all the understanding yet to be built. She was ready for it. Because that's what humans did. They built bridges. They found connections. They believed, against all logic sometimes, that understanding was always possible. And sometimes, belief was enough.